just pray that your hand would be upon it all. And Lord, help us to walk with grace, and help us, as Sondra said, help others who are feeling upset and agitated. Lord, help us to give them information. Help us to give them truth, because that's what a lot is missing. It's just truth. Lord, help us to be truth tellers and give them the information that they need to make wise choices. And may your hand be upon all of this and us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank
All
you,
right.
Deetta.
Now, education.
So tonight we have to think about our children, and if we're grandparents, many I'm sure are, like I am, our grandchildren. I mean, if we're grandparents, our grandchildren. But the focus has to be on our children and on our parents. Because you know, if you've paid any attention, what happened during the pandemic and when learning came not by way of a face-to-face interaction, but by way of a screen. And, no learning went on for the most part. And we are in deep trouble as far as our children having learned. And then on top of that, the movement that began during the pandemic was a handout that you have, and I don't have a slide for that, so don't move the slide yet, but a handout that has at the top of it recommendations for, I guess I have to go down here and get the handout. The Select Committee recommendations. So what happened during the pandemic, just as the pandemic launched, is that a resolution was brought forth on the House floor and passed. It went to the Senate and they just ignored it, thank goodness. But it was a select committee, and it did include a couple of Republicans from the House, and it was led by the House, to try to point out that we are racist, and when I say we, primarily those of us who are white or Caucasian, that we think that we're supreme, that we lord it over others because of the color of our skin. And you probably even heard that recently there is in the Atlantic Journal an article that says, even if you are a Catholic and you have your beads, your rosary, that's white supremacy. So there's a movement to put into our minds that we have done these awful things over the decades, over the centuries, and now it's time to correct that. And I tell you, I was in tears when I listened to this author, a black woman from Mendota Heights, Representative Richardson, read this on the House floor. So then when I just felt so awful because, serving the 23 years I did in the Minnesota legislature, I never thought of people by their religion or the color of their skin or their politics. I just didn't divide them away, especially by the color of their skin. I didn't see people that way. That was my colleague and I worked with her, or I worked with him, and it didn't make any difference what ethnicity or culture they might have. So that passed, and it was very hurtful for many of us. And then they submitted these recommendations. And if you turn, and you take this with you and you read through these so you know what would happen if the House does not, if my colleagues and the candidates on my side of the aisle do not prevail in this election, because this is what will be on the agenda. If you turn to the page where education is listed, these may sound like they are, yes, there are handouts here in the front. These may sound like there's nothing to them, but look at the second bullet under education. Increase subsidies for early childhood care and education, including those through the Child Care Assistance Program and early learning scholarships for communities experiencing the greatest educational disparities. Well, that sounds good, but that means that the government is going to have a lot of say in how your children are raised, because you have to know, anytime there's a subsidy, the government is the key player. whether it's in education or in some other facet of what is provided either through the federal Congress or the state legislature. And the third bullet also sounds just fine: increase investment in recruiting, training, retaining, and promoting teachers of color and indigenous teachers. But again, to me, this becomes, they're trying to make it very open, but it becomes discriminatory, because they're going out to provide money and training and retention policies and probably different promotions for teachers of color and indigenous, which is American Indian, as you know. So does that really bring us together, or does that divide us further? And I won't go on until I get down to implement civics and financial literacy requirements for high school students. Well, we all like to have civics taught, but if civics is going to be through the social studies standards, no, we don't want that. And so these recommendations, if you read them carefully and think carefully about the involvement of government, you know that these recommendations are leading us to socialism and really Marxism, because that's what's been occurring in the legislature, in the House of Representatives, in the majority party for the last 4 years, but it came long before that. Because you know, these changes, just like they do in Washington, they come surreptitiously, which means just quietly and sneakily, and we don't even notice it's happening because we're busy working, taking care of our families, and involved in our communities, and we don't see these steps that are occurring. So I have good news, and that's that the social studies standards, about which I spoke when I was here last time, are on hold, because I sent a really direct statement to the administrative law judge, and so he's put them on hold. And to the commissioner as well, and she's more scared than anyone, because she knows what'll happen if she's not the commissioner in the next 4 years. I just want to have a different governor. Yes. It must be a different governor, because we have to stop this. And I know I'm going to make political statements tonight, and you might not know that, you might not like that, but it just makes all the difference in the world to have people who have common sense, which I think conservatives do, and who have principles. The acronym I used over my years of service and still use is based on the word life. And ultimately, of course, it is the protection of the unborn. But the L stands for limited government. We can't have government growing and growing and growing. And in this next biennium, we could have as much as $12 billion in a projected surplus. $12 billion. I mean, that is really scary, because if Governor Walz is in charge, he's really going to want to spend and grow government. And that's what's happened over the last 4 years, because in the 21 session, there were 350 provisions in the Health and Human Services bill. And they're now at 18 billion over the biennium. Education's at 21 billion. Education, K-12, 21 billion, plus add another 3 to 4 for higher ed. Not accomplishing what they're supposed to. But when you have money lying on the table that's able to be spent, these programs that grow in Health and Human Services, they never go away. And they may help some of you, but they also help some who don't need to be helped, who should be working, who should have jobs. Because keep in mind, even though there's bragging in Washington and St. Paul about our low unemployment numbers, we have so many who never went back to work after the pandemic. It is huge. And as you realize, as you walk the streets of Cambridge or Princeton or North Branch or wherever you may go, help wanted, we're hiring. And they can't get employees. And I noticed here in Minnesota and in the nation too, that the number of those seeking unemployment benefits has been increasing every month. Well, that's not supposed to happen when we have all these jobs available. And it's true that you may start at a lower wage job, but they're there for a purpose. They're more like you work at McDonald's and that's part-time. That's to give you training so you can get a better job in some area, because you've learned how to deal with people, you've learned math, you've improved your communication skills. There are so many ways that these low-wage jobs, although in Princeton, I think McDonald's is paying $16 an hour. I'd probably go work there part-time for that, and really enjoy the people. But we're just so messed up. And it's not just because of the pandemic. It's been happening gradually, and we didn't necessarily see it coming. It's that word I like to use, surreptitious. So the social studies standards are on hold, and the PowerPoint begins just noting on the first one. So the first slide, if you would proceed to the first slide. Well, let's go to the next one. Oh, no, I want this one. What we're seeing in our K-12 systems, and that includes private and sometimes parochial indoctrination, not education. And the biggest culprit is the teachers' union. And I was a member of the teacher union for a lot of years, although I started teaching in Princeton when they didn't have a union. And so I can tell you the contrast between, and the union in Princeton when I was teaching was benign for the most part, but not union leaders. But I loved the fact that when I finished my first 3 years, each of those years, I was evaluated by my principal, and he was very direct with me. He told me what I needed to improve on and what I did well, and I really appreciated that because I grew. And, my salary, I think I started teaching in Princeton with a salary of, this is 1964, $3,600. But, that's what the salary was. I love teaching, and, that's what you do. So salary wasn't an issue, but having that ability to interact with the administration was so great. Now, the union really dictates. You can't have teacher evaluation and say anything negative. It's horrible. Anyway, that's what I call indoctrination, and the union is pushing all of this radical stuff about racism and gender identity, and you have to have the right pronoun, so and transgender and LGBTQ and whatever else it is, and we want to love all of those children and adults, but we don't have to accept their behavior. It is not biblical. And the goal, though, is to indoctrinate, and I think the teacher union has said at the leadership top, we want lots of spending, we want lots of time off, we don't want to be evaluated, and so we're going to make sure we have Democrats the rest of the ages, because they'll vote for more spending and all those other things that really is part of their agenda. So to get back to my acronym, LIFE, L is limited government. The I is to make sure that we are investing in, our financial aspect correctly. So it's election integrity, with an I, and it's making sure that we are spending in a way that's, I can't think of the I word that I used, but anyway, we have to be fiscally responsible, which really gets me to the F, that's fiscal responsibility. But the I, more individual freedom, that's what I used, individual freedom, because the Lord has created each of us with a purpose in mind as an individual, and we have to fulfill that. And then, so I said F, so L-I-F, fiscal responsibility and restraint. And finally, E is for education, excellence in education, which is the name, you noticed, of this PowerPoint. Then we get to economics, citizenship and government, history, and ethnic studies. And ethnic studies, of course, is the piece that really I have been most concerned about. But in every one of these areas, there is race and other ideas that have flowed in. And let me just point out a couple of examples in economics. Because the social studies standards right now are standards I opposed because they were recreating our American history, but otherwise they weren't too bad. But now these proposed standards are the hard lessons learned on the perils of communism and socialism. That's what's absent. They want kids to learn that there is no peril if you like to be a communist or a socialist. And while free markets have lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty, the systems of communism and socialism have left millions of people dead. I mean, really dead, through intentional acts of repression and failed economic policies. So, that's in the economic piece of the social studies standards. So, very, very dangerous for our kids to be recognizing that that's okay, and, they may want to live that way. I won't go into citizenship and government. Ethnic studies is really, the purpose is to divide us. So, I define culture as that which you were raised understanding in your family as part of your background. It was not negative. I was raised eating German foods because my father's heritage was very German. And so when we were at grandma's or we had the opportunity to have those dishes and those customs in our home, we practiced those, but we didn't say to other people, you've got to do the German stuff that we do. My mother, Norwegian, so, lefse, all of those goodies that go with that, those traditions, and my mother even spoke a lot of Norwegian. She did not start school. In fact, she died when she was 103, just a couple years ago. Anyway, she did not speak English when she started school. She had to learn it on her own, unlike today when they have umpteen teachers teaching our kids how to speak English if they don't speak it. But the point is, you don't impose culture as the overarching means by which everybody should live. And that's what's happening in ethnic studies, dividing us by race, dividing us by gender. In fact, they use gender. I say we're biologically males and females, and that's it. And that's the only path you go down. Dividing us by our beliefs, our customs, our language, and the list goes on and on. But mostly to divide us, I think, and to cast judgment on Caucasians, to make kids grow up knowing that we oppress and they're the oppressed. That's the theme. And that's what happens in ethnic studies. So I certainly hope that when I'm not there, that there will not be any move on the part of the commissioner, because she'll know that her nemesis is gone. Because as the lead in the policy committee, I was always the only one who was, countering the commissioner, countering the other side of the aisle on all of these, and I know they're going to be so happy to see me gone. But, I'm going to pray that they still, stand strong on this. Next slide, indoctrination, not education. I've kind of delineated that the proposed standards deviate from legitimate academic content. They direct students towards social or political activism. And then a quote that that's from Standard 24. Organize with others to engage in activities that could further the rights and dignity of all. The key word is all. Next slide for economics. I think I've covered that pretty well, because the last statement I made was the proposed standards fail to warn against communism. Then we go on to citizenship and government. The proposed standards call for a discussion on democratic values without any foundation on what these values should be. And some of the values I was quoting from my acronym LIFE, are the values that you should concentrate on. Government should not rule us. Government was created by our founders to be limited. And they empowered states also, but that's also to be limited. There's no context in distinguishing the rights of citizens and how those rights are established or recognized. The quote, citizenship and its rights and duties are established by law. So follow the law, which is, of course, what my my comments to the ALJ, the administrative law judge who determines whether or not these rules should go on, really centers on follow what's in statute. History, changing narratives is next, and it's terrible how they describe what settlers did. It was just like settlers, and God bless them because we had them all over this part of Minnesota. They weren't trying to take over the world. They weren't trying to colonize. The settlers were here because land was offered, and it was an opportunity for them to make a living. And what they loved most of all was making a living farming. Some logged, but many farmed. So, understood as an ongoing act, teaching non-Indigenous children they are active perpetrators of genocide. Because as you know, in this part of Minnesota, we are accused of having killed many of the American Indians. And yet, when you really study, you find out that the Dakota and the Ojibwe were at war, and they were killing each other, and they were killing the settlers as well. The proposed standards promote inclusion of absent or non-dominant narratives. And finally, it erodes adherence to shared values that form national identity, so that we love America. And we look to our Constitution as that document that's not a living document. It's a document that, as it was written, stands today, because those men, and supported by their wives, like in John Adams' case, understood. I mean, it's just phenomenal that they understood the future, and that these had to be, the Constitution had to be written in such a way that it would always be understood as a document that could be followed without having to be changed. Ethnic studies, uncharted territory, of course. The proposed standards don't just explore themes of identity or resistance, but actively promote them. And finally, reasons for public concern. And I know you've been diligent about this, and I want you to continue, to talk to parents. I think I have, and I'll share this later, some questions that parents should ask of their teachers. But, the academic standards undermine parental curriculum review. We have to be concerned about that. They are not supposed to undermine parental curriculum review. Parents are supposed to have, according to 120B.20, the ability to study and look at all curriculum that's presented to their children. Standards are not aligned to civics requirement. We have in law 120B.02 subdivision 3 that places that sets out what civics requirement is. And then we have proposed standards for exceeding the scope specified in statute. That's a reason for concern, and then the addition of ethnic studies. So let's move to my newest project, which I know someone in the audience is working on as well, and I'm so grateful for her. Was it Betsy? Yes. Praise the Lord that we have someone who understands this that's going on. So PALSB, it was actually created by me as the chief author of a bill to convert Minnesota's really mixed up licensure system to a tiered system. And one of my goals was to have these tiers because I don't believe that everyone who goes into a classroom needs to have a teacher preparation program. That we have, and Governor Carlson kind of started this idea. When he served as our governor, he created what he called a community expert. So schools could hire experts in a variety of areas and bring them in to teach the children. And the district would work to make sure that this teacher, this community expert, understood discipline and school policy and so on. But the Board of Teaching, on which I served, Arnie Carlson appointed me to it, and I found out how strong the union was there. I knew that serving as a legislator, we had to move away from that. So we created, and get this, the Professional Educators Licensing and Standards Board. Professional, because the Board of Teaching had become just kind of a side note to the union. I remember some of my first meetings serving on the board. Union members, leaders, these are leaders now, would speak up from the audience. They would interrupt the Robert's Rule of Order and just speak up. And I said to the chair, I think we have rules we're supposed to follow. They're not supposed to be speaking unless they're on the agenda or they ask to be called on. So we had great need to change to a different board, a different type of board. However, they still get appointed by the governor, and that's been a downfall because Governor Walz has appointed some very strong union leaders, and that's why we're ending up with these teacher preparation standards that are going to destroy our profession and destroy our children and our parents. So that's the name of the board. And the greatest concern I have is Standard 8. So turn to that handout I gave you called Racial Consciousness and Reflection. And just for a moment, take a look at that to see what is being planned. Now, would you say that's going to unify us or divide us further? I hope you're saying divide us further. So what's kind of interesting is that this committee that wrote, these are called the Standards of Effective Practice, and they are used by teacher preparation programs to prepare teachers for the classroom. Primarily, they should concentrate on content. You know, what's the major? I was an English major, so my subject area that I studied at college were courses that I would be using not necessarily to teach in a high school or junior high classroom, but they gave me the foundation for what I would teach as an English teacher, whether it was literature, or it was speech, or it was writing, or it was grammar. So those are kind of ignored in this this new presentation that they're sending to the administrative law judge, to which we have to make comments before August 24th. So that's why I was in my office today working on this. But notice the states that this committee has looked to. Washington, Illinois, and I don't know if I included the California page, but there was also a page that referred to California. So, racial consciousness and reflection, what does that have to do with content and pedagogy? Because teachers take, if they go through official teacher training programs, they have to pass 2 tests. They must. One in their content area, and in elementary it covers the 5 basic areas that elementary teachers will teach, and not difficult. At the high school level, it'll cover the major that you are planning to graduate using in the classroom. So for me, it would be the language arts test. They don't call it English anymore. Isn't that embarrassing? They call it language arts. So the language arts. And then the pedagogy is how you teach. And so they're embedding this in the standards of effective practice that teacher preparation programs use to teach their candidates what to do in the classroom. So every one of these has something to do with race or with ethnicity. So we look at the new draft 4 standard, and these are those that I'm addressing. The teacher understands multiple theories of race and ethnicity, including but not limited to racial formation, processes of racialization, and intersectionality, which is really a scary word. You know, we intersect. I mean, even in the Bible, we have intersecting passages because Isaiah may have said something that intersects with what Apostle Paul said later, or that Jesus even used in speaking in his preaching. So the word intersect is not a bad word, but here intersectionality has to do with all those different groups that they have allegedly decided that we all are a part of, at least our children. So, and my question to my researcher today was, how in the world does a teacher preparation program who has trouble teaching teachers how to teach reading have time to teach all this? I mean, what are they going to have to know to be able to do this? This is absolutely ridiculous. B, understands the definitions of and difference between prejudice, discrimination, bias, and racism. That should be understood. I mean, they should already know that. I mean, that's basic. C, the teacher understands how ethnocentrism, Eurocentrism, deficit-based teaching, and white supremacy undermine pedagogical equity. I mean, how scary is that? The teacher understands that knowledge, this is D now, knowledge creation, ways of knowing and teaching are social and cultural practices shaped by race and ethnicity, often resulting in racially disparate advantages and disadvantages. And I was talking to a parent the other day who said in this particular school district in central Minnesota that the parents had gone in and they had complained to the principal about their children coming home during summer school being asked to identify which pronoun they wanted to be called. And the principal said, this is nothing I support, but the teacher union is pushing these teachers to do that. So, you have to be, as grandparents or parents, so alert to what is going on in the classroom. And isn't that terrible that we have to be on their case every time they open their mouths now in case they're going to try to indoctrinate instead of educate our children? It is so sad. So, we have to stop these from going forward. And I have a really good document that I'm working on with my researcher that we hope to have ready very shortly. But, we're using parents really as our basis because it is parents who are being denied the right to have their children educated in a way that uplifts America, that really supports our Constitution and supports their values. And that's being denigrated. E, the teacher understands the histories and social struggles of historically defined racialized groups, including but not limited to Indigenous people, Black Americans, Latinx Americans, and Asian Americans. And again, I would think that this is something that at its face, teachers would understand. They don't have to have an intense study of the histories and social struggles that brought all this about, these racialized groups. Because again, it's a way to separate. Now, Washington writes their standard this way: the pre-service educator understands equity pedagogy, that's how you teach, and demonstrates self-understanding and knowledge of the histories, model characteristics, and intra-group differences of ethnic groups, which is not quite as harsh as ours, but still not acceptable. F, the teacher understands the cultural content, worldview, concepts, and perspectives of Minnesota-based American Indian tribal nations and communities, including indigenous histories and languages. Well, this has been going on for a while, and what disturbs me about this is that when I visit with the tribes, and we have 8 Ojibwa tribes, and basically the Dakota, which are divided into like 3 groups, or 3, whatever they use, is that they want their individual history to be taught to our children. And I've asked, like the Mille Lacs Band, whom I represent, how will the teacher have time to teach your history versus Boys Fort versus, the other tribes in the northern part of the state, the Ojibwa tribes? How do you have time to teach all those different histories? How do you do that? And how do you even know what's accurate in the histories? But that's really being pushed by our American Indians. And I think it's going to interfere with the ability for teachers to actually teach basic foundational knowledge and skills. I think that we can learn as we grow these individual histories if it's important. But at the K-12 level, it is important to give them the basic facts and how those facts played into our history, and then allow them to move on with further reading and further education. And that's true of me in all of these different racial, or as they call them, racialized groups. Finally, the teacher understands the impact of the intersection of race and ethnicity with other forms of difference, including class, gender, sexuality, which has become a really, negative subject in our schools, because asking children what gender they want to be plus what pronoun, religion, national origin, immigration status, language, ability, and age. So this is what the teacher colleges, the teacher preparation programs think is just going to be the best that they can do to prepare teachers for the future. So, reasons for public concern. I think you already know what they are. And these are some that I have cited, and you can read those on your own. I don't think I need to repeat those. And those who are viewing this online can see them printed on the screen. The hearing is, as I said earlier, August 24th, starts at 9 o'clock. For video and audio connection to join the hearing, there are directions here which you could do. I don't know if I will publicly appear. I may. But my documents will be there and will have been read already by the ALJ. And then there are directions for how you participate, etc. So now, questions, because I don't want you to leave here tonight with doom and gloom, because, I'm going to fight this to the end, and I know I have colleagues in the Senate who are not submitting any documents, relying on me, but they're also going to put up a big fight. We've already been through this in some respect, because the Senate Republicans worked really hard the last 4 years to raise the level of reading among our students by ensuring that all teachers know how to teach reading based on what's in our law. And our law is based on the scientific research that's been done. And it was enacted many years ago. I think we started in my early service, at least around 2000. Former Senator Jen Olson was a key player. And we got into law the fact that phonics is very important. And that's part of the scientific way to teach reading. But what we're finding out is, and this is what Senator Chamberlain found out as he was pushing this as a majority, that teachers do not know how to teach reading, and that's one of the reasons that we have so many children who can't read, because they're not learning how to read. And, teaching reading is very difficult. I've done it at the secondary level, and it's very difficult to read unless you have trained and learned in it. That's what teacher preparation programs need to focus on, because reading is a key to success. And if a child doesn't know how to read at the end of 3rd grade, they're doomed to fail the rest of their lives, because they have to read. And I know they're going to probably do a lot of it on their iPhones or whatever, but still they have to know how to read, and read fluently and understand what they're reading, because that's the key to being able to determine whether something is worthy or unworthy when it comes to the truth or objectivity. So that's essential. And finding out that most of our teachers who are trained in teacher prep haven't learned how to teach reading. It's required at the elementary level, but we also want it at the secondary. But the teacher prep programs are just laughing at it. That's what Senator Chamberlain told me. He said they just laughed when I told them what I was bringing forth in legislation. which was really a large amount of money to train teachers. Now, isn't that sad? That they've been through teacher preparation programs, they've been in the classroom many years, and the legislature has to fund so that they can get scholarships to participate in these programs. But that's what we've had to go to, is to provide funding, because the particular program that is out there that's really held up by those whose children are dyslexic and really got this movement going several years ago is very costly. I have taken the first few hours, and I'll tell you, it's strenuous. You have to pay attention to every step as you move through the process of dealing with a kindergarten child who may not even speak English, or a kindergarten child who's not very verbal. So, you really have to put a lot of effort into this. And that's why we have our elementary teachers spend so much time on reading and then on math. Those are the two main components. And of course, they are also in Every Student Succeeds, that federal act that replaced No Child Left Behind, required tests. Although in Minnesota, parents can opt their children out of the tests and have done so quite vigorously. And I don't have a problem with the tests. I just don't want teachers teaching the test. I want teachers to do such a good job in teaching the benchmarks of the standards in language arts reading that their children just breeze through the test. Yes, that's what should happen. Or if they struggle, they get extra time, and some are going to struggle. So I shouldn't say that common breeze through it, but for many, I talk to my grandson, and he'll just say, it's so easy. But, it's not easy for every child. So, you have to give them more time and be patient. But if they have learned how to decode using the phonetic method, and they've learned good, solid comprehension skills, because comprehension can be difficult too. I noticed that with my grandson. He's now 11. But when he was 7 and 8, he could read just, so well. But when I'd ask him to discuss with me what he read, it was a little iffy there. So I knew we had to work with him on how to understand what you read. Because you could do all the reading in the world, but if you don't understand what you read, then you've lost out. Because, of course, that's what leads to the key of success, is being able to understand what you read. Well, I'm going to stop there and ask for questions. Yes? I wrote to Pelsby this afternoon and asked their executive director if he knew who had been assigned, because I always have known previously when I have prepared these documents, because if you know who the administrative law judge is, you can key your document to what you know about him. And the first time that I wrote an extensive document about a rule that Pelsby wanted to promulgate, because rules become, that which the teacher prep programs will use and what licensure will use. I knew the ALJ, the administrative law judge, and I knew his politics. I just didn't realize what his argument against me was going to be, so I learned a really good lesson, because it was Eric Lippman, and he served with me in the legislature for just a very short time. But I knew that he was a strong conservative, and his criticism of my document was I didn't argue in favor of following the law. So we have statutes, of course. The education code is about this thick in the book. I mean, we have so many chapters that are dedicated to education, and there are specific statutes that are devoted to certain topics, and that was his criticism. So when I prepared the social studies document, I really laid it on thick with statute violation, because he was going to be the administrative law judge who heard that. So I was pretty sure that he was going to read that document and say, Representative Erickson learned her lesson. And she is arguing that that these standards do not support statute. Because if I went through the document that I prepared, and I kind of did that when I spoke here before, I hit many, many of our statutes in the education code to show how the social studies standards violate them, for primarily. But this time, it's not listed on the docket. You know, and the hearing is coming up August 24th, so I'm hoping that Executive Director Louisi knows and can tell me, because before I file my document, I may have to change some of my attack, not that it's really an attack, but some of my argument, because again, it's a violation of statute. But my researcher wants really the focus to be on how parents are shut out, which of course is violating statute too. And he is proposing to me that I argue that the rules for the standards of effective practice are inconsistent with statute because they do not support the ability of parents to intervene in curriculum and in advisory committees that set curriculum and in other matters that are a parental right. And